Is Canon about to release the RF 12mm and 16mm f2.8 and the RF Cine mount? Is Olympus coming out with a full-frame mirrorless camera? And Angelbird delivers firmware updates for their CFexpress cards. This and more after the intro. Hi, I'm Simon. Thanks for tuning in to The Ordinary Filmmaker. Subscribe to get notification of new videos like this one so you don't miss any news, rumors, gear reviews, or tutorials. And a big thanks to Atomos for sponsoring The Ordinary Filmmaker. I'm using the Ninja 5 external recorder for all my studio work as it saves me a ton of time in post. Want to speed up your project in post? Well then use my links down below to purchase your own Ninja. And now for the news. Canon News discovered two patents. One is for the RF 12mm f2.8 and the other's for the 14mm f2.8. But where's that 16mm that I've been looking for? It's like Canon's teasing me. I think most of you are aware that I'm looking for a good 16mm lens that's nice and wide at f2 or f2.8. But the 14mm is nice and wide at f2.8, but it might start to distort facial features, making my nose look a little bit like Olympus Mons. Will the Canon RF 14mm be good enough? Well, it's still a patent, so we'll have to wait and see, but there's still a large gap between 24mm and 14mm on the prime side. These are the embodiments for the 14 and 12mm lenses. Canon also discovered a patent for an RF Cine mount with a shorter back focus. The gist of this patent application is to provide another means to locking the lens onto the mount using a standard bayonet mount. And this would certainly address issues with fitting adapters onto the mount. Again, it's a patent filing, so it might be a while before we see this, if at all. Is Olympus working on a full-frame camera? Will this be their WOW camera? The Japanese site DC Life is speculating about a possible L-mount move from OM Digital. Included in their argument, DC Life states that the L-mount Alliance announced new partners are coming soon. Now, DC Life is referencing this quote from Panasonic's Yamane-san. We meet periodically to maintain our relationship, and right now we're discussing how to expand the L-mount system. We need some new ideas to expand the system to a wider variety of customers. We cannot disclose details, but at the moment we're discussing changes to the communication protocol between the cameras and lenses. Well, it sounds like the door's open, but he goes on. Please understand that this is purely hypothetical, but the number of members of the L-mount Alliance may increase in the future. Okay, so it's anything far from concrete, but OM Digital joining the Alliance would provide greater access to lenses for OMD customers. Now, the second point DC Life makes is that OM Digital is now free from Olympus's philosophy of sticking to Micro Four Thirds. This is true, but under GIP, OM Digital on multiple occasions stated that their commitment to Micro Four Thirds as early as July 2020. There's some pretty obvious questions here. One, does full frame make sense for the brand? And is there a return on investment in a relatively short order? Now, is it also a priority for OM Digital? Now, if they did pursue full frame, it would be their first big departure from Olympus since being spun off. And it would be a good way for us to be wowed by a company so dedicated to Micro Four Thirds. But this is essentially all conjecture. There isn't an ounce of evidence, making this no more than great coffee talk, conjecture, speculation. And really, there's nothing wrong with that, but for this to have an ounce of truth to it, there needs to be some sort of communication trail about OM Digital joining the L-mount Alliance, some sort of communication, some leaked email, something indicating that it's a topic, and we haven't seen that. And short of that, all we have is a really great, intriguing idea. But what do you think? Will the WOW camera be full frame? Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Angelbird developed firmware update 1.30 for CFexpress cards, and this firmware update can be applied if you have a Windows or Mac system. Now, the update does also include a fix for Mac users that removes that 5-second delay when you first turn on the Canon R5. You'll remember that Angelbird did release a firmware update a couple of months ago for Windows users, and 1.30 doesn't include that update that fixes that 5-second delay, so you don't have that anymore. However, if you do have an M1 Mac like me, the installation process is a little bit more detailed due to the new operating system security settings. Angelbird did create a video and manual to help guide you through it. And I've included a link to both of those for both the Windows and Mac updates in the description down below. Now, me personally, I've updated all my cards to the latest firmware and I haven't had any issues. And it's really nice to see that 5-second delay gone. And now, let's go behind the scenes. So here's a quick update on the M1 MacBook Air that I was editing with yesterday. It's got 8 gigabytes, it's got 512 gigabytes for an SSD, and it's not the fastest one, and there's a very good reason for that. I was calling it, Simon, why didn't you get the faster GPU and more RAM? Well, because the capabilities of this machine are designed not for video, but as a home computer for education, for homework, that kind of stuff. And I really didn't see the need to spend extra money, several $100s more, on a computer when I was planning to buy a MacBook Pro as my primarily editing machine. So let's take a look at some of the details from yesterday and how fast it was to edit, export, and publish. First of all, let's take a look at editing. Now, editing on the M1 was pretty fast. It was snappy, there were no delays. Now, granted, I was working with Apple ProRes because that's what I have coming right out of the Ninja 5. But this is where things get a little bit interesting on the export. As you might be aware, I'm working on a family video, and I started in December and continue it to right up now. And currently there's 44 minutes. It's 4K video, it's shot on the Canon R5, it's 4K HQ, and that's at least 470 megabits per second. I also have some 8K video in there, which is quite a bit faster, probably taking up somewhere around 1800 megabits per second. So I export in H.265 and 44 minutes in H.265 exported in 52 minutes. Now, this was on my iMac Pro, that computer that cost $6,000 US or about $7,200 Canadian. Well, I exported that video on my M1 as I told you yesterday, and it took 28 minutes. Staggering 28 minutes and 13 seconds. Right, remember that number. So when I exported the video yesterday, which was 10 minutes and 52 seconds, guess how long it took? Now, I exported it not in H.265, so that will bear some difference here. But I exported it using compressor settings for YouTube so that YouTube is pretty happy with me and gets my video published quicker. Believe it or not, it took 28 minutes. Yep, it took 28 minutes to export a 10-minute and 52-second video. Why is that? Well, there's a couple of reasons that I think potentially could be the reason for this, and I have to do further testing to find out. But one is I'm not using H.265. I'm using H.264, and I'm using a different set of parameters that Compressor has that YouTube likes. Second, I'm not using any plugins when I publish my family video. You'll notice that I have plugins along the side here that give me, I can put in all sorts of information here. And I didn't have a lot yesterday. I should have had more because, well, I had some issues. This is embarrassing. So I got the laptop ready, I did everything the night before, and then when I went to edit the video, I realized I was missing some plugins, and I used MotionVFX. They have some really good plugins, but I couldn't get them working for about 10 minutes. So when I finally got it working, I didn't have time, based on what I had for my lunch break, to get it updated. But those plugins are relatively processor intensive. When I had my iMac Pro, whenever I was working with those plugins, the system would just slow right down. I'd basically turn off rendering, do what I had to do, and then I'd have it rendered to properly be able to preview it because it was super slow. And I think that would have a big impact on how long it would take to render out the video. But I was quite surprised. I mean, that's really the only difference. They're both using Apple ProRes 422. I just don't know why it took so long to export it. The only thing, I think the most logical thing is I wasn't using H.265, which is hardware accelerated on the M1 Max, and also those plugins, they are very resource intensive. So that was really interesting. And I'm going to keep giving you my feedback on these computers. And as I said, when it comes to the M1, if you're going to be doing any sort of 4K editing, I really don't recommend getting the MacBook Air or the MacBook Pro because the most you can put in them is 16 gigabytes. And I do recommend, if you're going to do any sort of video editing, get 16 gigabytes. But ideally, if you're going to do any sort of 4K editing, I highly recommend 32 gigs. Now, if you're on Windows, you might want to go 64 gigs. Now, for my new MacBook Air that I'm getting, not MacBook Air, the new MacBook Pro that I'm planning on getting, depending on what Apple throws into it, I'll get a minimum of 32 gigabytes if it's supported. I really do hope it's supported, and I also hope they support 64 gigs. But here's my thing. If we were working with Intel processors, I'd definitely go with 64 gigabytes. But with Apple's new processor, where the RAM is right on the die itself, system on a chip, there's certain efficiencies there. So I'm not, and this is a tough thing with Apple, because the boneheads like to solder everything onto the computer, I have to make that decision early on. And Apple's RAM, it isn't cheap. It's not cheap at all. In fact, for the price of upgrading to 32 gigs, I could easily get 64 gigs or more. But, you know, don't blame a duck for quacking, right? All we can do is rant and complain, and hopefully Apple will finally listen to us. And from what I've seen, they do listen to us. It just takes about 5 years before what we rant and rave about to actually make it to the actual finished units. But that's it for now. Don't forget to subscribe for your chance to win 2 Angelbird 128GB AV Pro MK2 V90 SD cards, along with a dual UHS-2 SD card reader. Or you could also win a Ulanzi LED light package with accent lights, an underwater light, and various other flat panel lights to light your subject, or as a great starter kit for you or somebody else starting their own YouTube channel. I'll be awarding these 2 prize bundles once the channel reaches 30,000 subscribers. Then I'll offer up a different prize bundles every 10,000 or so subscribers until the channel reaches 100,000, at which point I'll be awarding a brand new Canon EOS R5 full-frame mirrorless camera to one lucky viewer. And on that bombshell, thanks so much for watching The Ordinary Filmmaker. We'll see you again soon.